Well, this Wednesday on Porridge, help and advice about substance abuse.
Yes. Welcome back to the Porridge Show. Big up yourselves if you're still locked into your Porridge Show. And yes, it's Wednesday. And yes, we are discussing your recovery and rehabilitation while you do your time through that gate. You get me? Now, last week was Ask Dr. Linda, and don't forget, next Wednesday, the 10th of May, we are still going to revisit it. So if you didn't hear your questions answered, we are going to speak to Dr. Linda again next Wednesday, the 10th of May. Now, back in today, this morning, we are talking to Julian, who works in recovery at HMP Grendon. Good morning, Julian. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, your role, and is there a typical day for you?
My name is Julian Reid, and I'm a drug and alcohol recovery worker at HMP Grendon. I work for the NHS for an organisation called Inclusion, and essentially a typical day would involve a variety of screening new arrivals at the prison to see if they have any current or previous history of issues of substance misuse, and working with existing clients on our caseload, those who are keen to resolve substance misuse issues. And then it would also be, when the opportunity allows, facilitating group work, and then also events in which we have speakers from the recovery community come in to speak with the men in our care.
So today, you're here to talk us through the language we use around drug and alcohol addiction and rehabilitation, and the meaning behind some of the words that we hear and maybe use on a regular basis. So, addiction.
So in the broadest possible sense, addiction is defined as the continued compulsive use of a substance or behaviour despite harm to self and or others. And the key piece is really the behaviours, whether or not they cross this threshold of impairing function. So you have what are referred to as substance addictions, alcohol, crack cocaine, but then you also have what are referred to as process addictions, for example, sex addiction, gaming, gambling.
What is the difference between abstinence versus recovery?
Yeah, so abstinence essentially means self-imposed restraint. This is a conversation that I'm really keen to have with the men who I work with at Grendon, because often what happens is that many people were in active addiction at the time that they committed their offences, were arrested and subsequently imprisoned. And this means that they were kind of forcibly separated from their addiction, but ultimately they haven't really treated the underlying issues of the addiction. So when you simply stop using, sometimes a person can experience what is referred to as white knuckling it, white knuckle sobriety, holding on through sheer willpower. In Alcoholics Anonymous, they call this as being a dry drunk. You're not actually drinking, but you're restless, irritable, discontent, experiencing all the underlying issues. So in abstinence, an individual makes a lot of effort to stay away from alcohol and drugs, but doesn't really address the underlying issues which led to the uncontrolled drinking or use in the first place. So we can contrast that with recovery, and recovery is, it's this idea that recovery gives you a clear scaffolding and a framework for life, and it actually helps you to connect with your inner self. So a recovery framework obviously helps the addicted person to experience connection. And it has been said that the opposite of addiction is connection.
Relapse.
Essentially, a relapse is when a person returns to using drugs or alcohol after a period of sobriety. And the point that I'm often keen to make to the men with whom I'm working at Grendon is that actually, if you have just been experiencing abstinence in the sense if you stopped using when you came to prison or have achieved a period of physical abstinence but haven't actually done any work to address the underlying issues, then I question if whether or not it can actually be called a relapse. In the sense that what I mean is that often people simply press the pause button on their using. They press the pause button. Often the men within the custodial environment will swap that for compulsive exercise or other compulsive behaviours. It could be binge eating, it could be, any one of other substitute activities. It's a really challenging conversation to have because think about it like this. You could have a person who has been physically abstinent from alcohol and other drugs for a not insignificant period of time, and they quite rightly could be really pleased with themselves and really proud of themselves. So if you think that as a drug worker, having to suggest to them that actually they might just be experiencing physical abstinence and they're at really high risk of relapse if the opportunity presents itself. For example, if substances become available on the wing, or if when they are released into the community, obviously going back to old patterns of behaviour, people, places and things, and not having done the inner work that is vital to bring them to a recovered state.
And what about lapse, and what does lapse mean?
So, the term lapse can often cause a great deal of confusion because we use the term lapse to describe, I suppose, an isolated incident of use, a one-off. Let's say you have a person who has a long history of addiction and then they might use on a one-off basis. We might call that a lapse because it has not resulted in a full-blown relapse, uncontrolled dependent using on a daily basis. Now, I have to say, though, that we need to be very careful because we do know that for a lot of addicted individuals, a single use can trigger a full-blown relapse. And the consequences of that can be a return to prison if they're out in the community. It can be death if they overdose or if they have access to a bad batch. So I'm often concerned about the use of the term lapse. The reason as drug workers that we use that term, I suppose not to discourage a person if they are in danger of being very hard on themselves and, thinking, I've thrown away all the good work that I've done. I was doing so well. I had, a year of abstinence and now I've used, I'm a failure. Oh, what the heck? I may as well get back on it, start using again. So we use the term lapse, I suppose, to reduce the risk of that happening. However, we do need to be very careful that the use of that term does not minimise the consequences of the person's using, because a person might think, oh, well, if I have a cheeky little lapse, it's no big deal. Maybe I'll have a lapse this weekend, so we do need to be careful about the way that we use this language and we frame these things.
Perhaps is a term to use in hindsight to label a behaviour after it has happened?
I think that's a great way of putting it.
What's meant by triggers?
So I always say that drug workers can be guilty of being fixated on triggers. And sometimes that fixation can be transmitted to our clients as well. And if you think about a lot of relapse prevention sessions, they might involve writing down a list of triggers. Let's get a big piece of paper and our marker pens and write down all our triggers, kind of walking past a pub, Christmas, watching Match of the Day on telly and being reminded of football, hearing a song that reminds me of drinking, all these kind of triggers. And within the custodial environment, obviously anniversaries of offences or significant events can be triggers, or for residents of jails. So what I'm always very keen to say is that actually being in a recovered state, being in recovery, it reduces the importance of triggers, because stuff is always going to happen. Things are always going to happen. Life is going to happen. And if your approach to recovery is one of trigger avoidance, then you're going to be in trouble, particularly when you get out of jail. Because the first time that you walk down the high street, or the first time that you go into Sainsbury's and you see the magic wall, and when I say the magic wall, I mean Smirnoff, Bacardi, Stella, all these things that for a dependent drinker, obviously that is a classic example of a trigger. Whereas recovery is about, I suppose, a mindset, a state of consciousness that you ascend to and that you cultivate, so that on the worst day possible, if everything went wrong and you came into contact with all of your triggers, if you're, doing the work and you're in solid recovery, you ain't using. You ain't going to pick up, you ain't going to relapse, because you'll have done the work and you'll be solid. It might be difficult, it might be tough, you might be tempted, but if you're in a solid recovered state, exposure to your triggers will not mean the end of you. Now, that means often, people will talk about testing themselves. I've heard man talk about relapsing by saying, I wanted to test myself, so I went to the pub and had a Diet Coke. That's a really daft thing to do. That is reckless and irresponsible and not sensible. However, if you were invited to a christening or a social event and you had good reason to be there, why can't you attend? Recovery is not about hiding away from the world. Recovery is about participation in the world. But obviously, you have a strategy in place, you have a plan in place, and most important, you need to be on solid recovery ground.
Is it part of a strategy of recovery important to identify your possible triggers?
Well, let's differentiate between, situational triggers, I guess what we refer to as people, places and things, but then emotional triggers. So for me, if someone says, I relapsed because I walked past the pub, and I went in and had and got drunk, that doesn't tell us anything at all. And on that subject of relapse, there are 3 stages of relapse, and the key to relapse prevention is to understand that relapse is not an event, it is a process, and it begins weeks and sometimes months before an individual uses. So the goal of effective recovery work is to help individuals recognise the early warning signs. And so the stages of relapse are emotional relapse, mental relapse, and then finally physical relapse, when you end up using. And so I would say that trigger avoidance in terms of situational triggers is not really relevant in terms of staying away from the first drink or the first drug. Now, don't get me wrong, it is in the early days. It is in the early days of recovery, and also, I suppose, the early days on a prisoner's release back into the community. But actually, the single biggest relapse trigger that I have observed over the years is, an emotional state. It would be the subcategory of resentment known as self-pity. So when you carefully review with a person why they were using, often they'll describe having had a lot of self-pity, kind of really feeling sorry for themselves about situations that weren't going their way. And that was actually the trigger. So it was actually the emotional state as opposed to anything that life had presented.
Thank you for today, Julian. A really insightful chat, putting you a bit on the spot here, but would you like to choose a song?
A song that I would like to choose? Well, being from Liverpool brings with it certain responsibilities. So one of those responsibilities